Welcome. Welcome, folks who are joining in. You're coming in during this moment. Welcome to, this is the fourth Indigenous education session that we're on. And today we have Jenna Webber with us from IAAW. So I'll probably just give it maybe a couple minutes just to let some people roll in that case. We got around 14 participants. And then as usual, we'll start with the discussion that we have going on today. But of course, just thank everyone for taking their time out of this afternoon to spend it with us to have this very important discussion on residential schools. These sessions here, they are made possible by the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. They're the ones that have been able to make us provide this for free for people. And then also to this session will be recorded also after for folks to view, and also to you'll be able to use it as a resource too in its own way, which is really cool. So yeah, thanks everyone. As I say, we'll just give it probably just a minute or two, and then we'll start with what we got going on this afternoon. This is also your first time attending one of these Indigenous education sessions. These ones are also hosted by an organization called the Center for Race and Culture here in Edmonton. So I work for the Center for Race and Culture. My name is Josh Morin. I work as their Indigenous education specialist, and I am currently providing these Indigenous education sessions. And I'm very grateful, and I'm very honored to be able to bring in wonderful guest speakers and people who are very knowledgeable in what they're coming to talk about. So we'll probably start just going on with the session today. But I just want to welcome our guest speaker today. We got Jenna Webber. She is the Justice Systems Navigator for the Greater Edmonton area at the Institute for the Advancement of Aboriginal Women, also known as IAAW. So I am just very honored to have Jenna here in this session. We've known each other, behind the scenes and at other parts, and we're actually kind of excited that we're finally able to do a project or, a session together in that case. So today we will be doing a very important discussion on residential schools. So I just want to let everyone remind that this is a safe space, absolutely safe space for people to learn, safe space for folks to ask questions. Also too, because with pretty much all the topics we've been talking about, but especially when we're talking about residential schools, excuse me, it may possibly trigger certain emotions in that case for people. And with that, we always recommend, I at least always recommend, if you have anyone you can trust or anyone you can talk to in that case, absolutely talk to them if you do have any emotions in that case. And sometimes they do come up even like a couple days or a week after the session. So just making sure to reach out in that case. I always let people know too, I am someone too you can reach out if you have any questions. I'm sure Jenna is another person too you could absolutely reach out to if you have any other questions regarding this session. I always let people know when it comes to me anyway, it's a safe space to talk in that case. And when it comes to questions, you can absolutely ask any question as long as it's presented in a respectful way. In that case, so we always definitely encourage Q&A for people when it comes to these kind of discussions. And yeah, that's kind of a little bit of the what I like to talk about before we start with the sessions that we're going on. So I do have a poll too, if folks want to do a poll here. We usually do it with our education session. Oh, never mind, not for this one. That's okay. So we'll move on to. So start with the land acknowledgement. The Center for Race and Culture respectfully acknowledges that we are located on Treaty 6 territory and within the Métis homeland, and that we all live and work on the traditional homelands of the Indigenous peoples of Canada. We honor the elders past and present who call this land home and strive to understand our shared colonial history and work together towards a just future that includes and enriches all peoples. So I always have this map from nativeland.ca. They're a great website if you're wanting to look on what traditional territory you're on. Say if I ever traveled to another province and I wasn't sure if I was on a treaty territory or even unceded land, in that case, I could type it in and this will probably give me the answer, or at least a good idea in that case. And you also get an idea on the territory boundaries. So as I explained before, this is a safe space in that sense for learning, for asking questions, and everyone here, you are absolutely welcomed in this circle. So here we are to welcome Jenna Webber. She has agreed to do this session with us on residential schools and the legacies of colonialism. Just to let folks know, if you have just been jumping in, Jenna Webber, she is the Justice Systems Navigator for the Greater Edmonton area at the Institute for the Advancement of Aboriginal Women, also known as IAAW. To know more about Jenna is a Cree Métis woman from Northern Alberta who has spent the majority of her years in Edmonton. Her career pathway has led her to her current role at IAAW, where she advocates for Indigenous women who are experiencing barriers in accessing community resources or who need assistance in navigating complex institutions, including the legal system. It is also part of Jenna's duty to coordinate and provide training opportunities to increase awareness and eliminate barriers to justice experienced by Indigenous women. She has been advocating for justice since she can remember. So I'm very excited to have her with us for this session today, and very excited to learn too on what she has to share also. So today we are talking about residential schools. If you're not aware of what residential schools are, or if you just have a little bit of an idea of what residential schools are, then this is absolutely the session you want to be at, because we are going to explain to you, as it says, residential schools and the legacy of colonialism, the impacts that it has laid on our people. So according to the Canadian Encyclopedia, they define it as residential schools were government-sponsored religious schools that were established to assimilate Indigenous children into Euro-Canadian culture. And I'll get a bit too into even what the word assimilate means. So it went on for over 150 years. First Nation, Métis, and Inuit children were taken from their families and communities to attend schools. They were often located far from their homes, or they were always at least located outside the communities in that case. Sometimes though you had ones that were located right in communities. St. Albert, they had a school that was located right on the old Mission Hill called the Uvil School. More than 100,000 children attended residential schools. Many never returned. The first church-run Indian residential school was opened in 1831. By the 1880s, the federal government actually adopted an official policy of funding residential schools across Canada. The explicit intent was to separate children from their families and cultures. In 1920, the Indian Act made attendance in residential schools compulsory. It was mandatory, basically. For those of you who attended our first Indigenous education session, I'm sure you remember when that was mentioned. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, the TRC, concluded that residential schools were a systematic government-sponsored attempt to destroy Aboriginal cultures and languages and to assimilate Aboriginal peoples so that they no longer existed as distinct peoples. The TRC characterized this attempt as cultural genocide. So this all comes from what is now called the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, which is a great website if any of you want to learn more on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's Canada report, and also just generally the impacts of residential schools. So in my family, of course, I have aunts and uncles who definitely were in the residential schools. Interesting enough, my grandma, she actually attended public school, one of the really public schools in the Calgary area, and then her mother, she was in residential school. She was in the one here in St. Albert, the Uvil school, I believe. So in my family, there absolutely is that history of residential school. And I always tell folks and remind them that any Indigenous person you meet, they will absolutely have an impact from the residential school system. With my family, we were raised, quite, in the culture and always knowing we were Métis in that case, but, we didn't speak much of the language in that case. Now, I grew up hearing words of Cree and Chif, in that regard, but really, we worked hard to really reconnect that aspect of our culture in that case. So that's just one example from my side of it. And even my great grandfather, Paul Villeneuve, he was a residential school survivor, and he still ended up going to fight in World War I, World War II, and then even ended up retiring out in the St. Albert area, and even worked on the Bayou Ranch in his earlier days too. He was a pretty cool person, but same thing for him. He was forced into the residential school system. So this map here provides an idea of where residential schools were located across Canada. As you can see, as far as the Maritimes and as easily as far west as British Columbia and as far north in Nunavut. Alberta particularly, they had, I believe, 25 out of the 130 operated here in Alberta. So there was a large amount in Alberta, and particularly in the prairie provinces. They had a lot of residential schools there. And you can see in BC too, in the Vancouver area. So if you're not sure what assimilation is, assimilation in anthropology and sociology, the process whereby individuals or groups of different ethnic heritage are absorbed into the dominant culture of a society. The process of assimilating involves taking on the traits of the dominant culture to such a degree that the assimilating group becomes socially indistinguishable from other members of the society. As such, assimilation is the most extreme form of acculturation, and that comes from Britannica.com. Once again, going back to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, the Canadian government pursued this policy of cultural genocide because it wished to divest itself of its legal and financial obligations to Aboriginal people and gain control over their land and resources. If every Aboriginal person had been absorbed into the body politic, there would be no reserves, no treaties, and no Aboriginal rights. And that comes from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada in the summary of their final report on page 3. That's another great resource I would recommend folks check out. So just a couple quick things, like Edmonton, the Edmonton area was the location of 2 residential schools, the Edmonton Indian Residential School, which ran from 1924 to 1966. This one is located where the Poundmaker Cemetery is currently, and Poundmaker's Lodge. And then you also have the Uvil Residential School, which was open from 1873 to 1948. And that one was located right on the top of Mission Hill in St. Albert. The first residential school opened in 1831 in Brantford, Ontario, and the last school closed in Punipee, Saskatchewan, 1996. Over 130 schools operated in Canada from 1831 to 1996. As mentioned before, 25 out of the 130 residential schools operated in Alberta, and more than 100,000 First Nation, Inuit, and Métis children are forced into the residential school systems. Orange Shirt Day. This day is past now. We're on to November, but now this day is a statutory holiday that was created. If you're not aware of why we wear orange shirts, Orange Shirt Day was a day created after residential school survivor Phyllis Webstad shared her story at a St. Joseph Mission Residential School commemoration project and reunion event held in Williams Lake, British Columbia in 2013. What she shared was that at the age of 6, Phyllis attended residential schools, and on the first day was stripped of her new orange shirt that her grandmother had bought her. Orange shirt now symbolized how the residential school systems took away the Indigenous identities of Indigenous children who attended. On this day, it is encouraged that Canadians reflect on the history of residential schools and the continued legacy of colonialism. And September 30th marks the first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. So of course, this day honors the lost children and survivors of residential schools and their families and communities. So it's just very important to recognize the reason why we wear orange shirts and why we do it on Orange Shirt Day. And now that this day, September 30th, is considered a statutory holiday, but as I said, it's highly encouraged that you reflect on the history of residential schools and the continued legacy of colonialism on this day. So one last slide before we hand it over to Jenna is to touch on the unmarked graves, which was a moment of truth for Canada. For us as Indigenous peoples, we were very aware of this. We have always told stories of our relatives that never came home, and we definitely had an idea of where they were. So with this one, what kind of sparked this one was 4 months ago. Well, this was written here in September 28th. So we're on 2 months ahead. So 6 months ago, in Canada, there was international headlines that marked that they had discovered 215 unmarked graves near the former Kamloops Indian Residential School in British Columbia. The next month, the âpahkowâyânaw First Nation announced a similar finding of 751 unmarked graves near Uvil Indian Residential School in Saskatchewan. And then a further 160 were found at a site of Cooper Island Residential School near Vancouver, with many more Indigenous communities taking up their own searches for their own similar sites. This was written from Karine Duhamel, September 28th, 2021 on the worldpoliticsreview.com. So this was a real eye-opener for a lot of Canadians, but also for us as Indigenous people, as I said, this is something we've kind of always we've always been aware of this in that case. We always had questions of where our relatives were, where they went, and if they were taken to residential schools, we had a kind of an idea of where they were in that case. Currently in St. Albert, we are going to start looking at the 2 schools that are in St. Albert, and just to see if we find anything in that case. It's been a very interesting journey, but it's one that's very important. I think people should know in that case, because these are our relatives that we are finding in that case. So just to stop with that, I will pass it over to our speaker, Jenna. And yeah, as I say, I am excited. I'm just excited what she has prepared, and I'm excited to learn in regards to what she has to share in that case. And I think you should be able to share. I think I have it set up on your end for the share screen.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thanks everyone for coming today to discuss such a heavy topic that demands a lot of work to acquire the truth and to move towards the reconciliation that Canada wants to acquire with the Indigenous people of this land. With that said, I know we have a limited time, because you could honestly do probably a lifetime of work in this area and still not comprehend and have a full understanding of the intricacies and the what is it called, the colonial legacy and the remnants that have been left to stain, I think, all of Canada. Okay, so let me just bring this up here. Again, I just want to say that this is just one presentation and it is 1 hour if we leave part-time for questions at the end. And there is a lot to go through. I'm going to just give a very high-level overview. In the top left corner, thank you, Josh. I will reiterate again, please reach out to people who are close to you. If you're feeling like you need more than just a conversation to chew on some of the stuff that you're hearing or that is being reheard, then please reach out. There are hotlines such as the National Indian Residential School Crisis Line, seen here on the screen. Again, my name is Jenna. You heard a little bit about my bio. I am Cree-Métis from, I used to say Alberta, just because I've kind of been here most of my life, but as a child, I went to school in the United States, in BC. I actually was born and my family is from Calling Lake and the Athabasca area. And I also have kinship connections up north in Paddle Prairie on the Métis settlement. And really, I just spent my lifetime trying to unpack why children sometimes struggle in school and why the system is not built to, I guess, deliver all children to pathways that are congruent and in alignment with who they are and where they're coming from. And that had a lot to do, I think, with that cultural dissonance. So that sort of, I guess, contradictions of the systems that I was brought up with, which is a very strong Indigenous principled Métis family, and having to integrate within dominant systems that are Eurocentrically based and supported. So I think prior to even diving into this topic, I just want to say that I will say the words Indian residential schools, because ultimately, and I think Josh kind of touched on that, is that it was an assimilation tactic. So further than that sociological perspective of wanting, or this facade of wanting Indigenous children to integrate into Canadian society, it was more about distinguishing or extinguishing rather the Indian title and entitlement that came with that. And by means of a residential school, this would be the attempted and the closest pathway to effectively removing that Indian title and entitlement from the Canadian structures. What does that mean? Let's find out. Okay, so government-led and church-run institutions. I really want to reinforce this because, especially now that, you know, and in Alberta, the education system is sort of in these waves of reorganizing and restructuring curriculum and figuring out how to respond to calls in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to inform children from kindergarten to grade 12 about Indian residential schools, coupled with the fact that in Alberta, for the first time in history, teachers are required to actually have developed and knowledge around the Indian residential schools and their impacts on First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. So with that said, I really want to reinforce our language around Indian residential schools as the formal title, but to recognize and to share when we're dabbling with this topic in the forum of schools, that these are government-led and church-run institutions. They were never meant to be schools. Schools was almost a word to connotate that these institutional settings were something that were beneficial to society, that were beneficial to the kids that attended. and they absolutely were not. The actual origin of the design and the idea to reinforce this system came from Nicholas Flood Davin, who toured the USA industrial schools, which you can see a model of on the right. And he said, and not in his words saying Indigenous children, but that Indigenous children, quote, should be removed from their homes as the influence of the wigwam was stronger than that of the day school. So saying that if children were to attend a missionary school or a government funded day school where they were allowed to return home at the end of the day, the influence of their families would still allow them to be connected to who they were and who they rightfully are entitled to be, and designed or encouraged implementing this design within Canada. So I bring up this image particularly because it's slightly, mirrors today's circumstances, I suppose, in some ways, but it's very alarming to me that a school design would contemplate a cemetery on their grounds, which you can see at the top of the screen. So it's not only Indigenous families who knew that this was happening and that it was maybe ultimately planned for. A few dates, again, just to share that. I think it was ultimately reviewed already, but in 1885, that's when Canada decides to operate industrial schools. And in 1896, the program of studies is issued, and it stresses the importance of replacing native tongue with English. In 1920, that's when the mandatory attendance came about, as we know, or as we just heard. And in 1969, that's when Indian Affairs takes over the sole management of residential schools from churches after multiple grievances from multiple people, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, that we'll take a look at in a second. After that, in 1975, mostly prompted by the fact that despite all efforts of attempted genocide to Indigenous peoples, we still survived, and it was not good enough bang for the buck for the government, so the residential schools started to close. 15 remained in 1975, with the last 139 Indian residential schools in Canada closing in 1996. That year also, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples published a report and brought the Indian residential school issues to the national attention. So that was sort of the first, I guess, national investigation into this, this dark but blatant history in Canada. Okay, so we talked about this as well. You mentioned to eliminate that financial or fiduciary obligation. So what's meant by that is it wasn't necessarily, or I'll just read the quote. So John A. Macdonald's Deputy Superintendent General of Indian Affairs assured him that Indian expenditures were a good investment. What was meant by that is because at the time of the Royal Proclamation in 1763, that document declared that when Europeans decided to settle here, it was not, they did not come to a place that was vast and empty. It was a place that had societies, it had economy, it had politics, it had systems of kinship and languages and very sophisticated ways of navigating a land that was so diverse and so challenging for the settlers that came here. And with that, the proclamation, the Royal Proclamation said that as you expand your boundaries, negotiations with those peoples needs to occur before you are able to advance the boundaries of expansion. Coupled with that, when it comes to the British North American Act, which is now the Constitution, in 1867, that declared, okay, whatever promises were made by the king, by the crown to the Indigenous peoples must be kept up with the Indigenous peoples of that place, which was documented in the word Indian. With that said, it said that any negotiations, the federal government versus the province, so there's the province and the federal government is responsible for making sure that Indigenous people are compensated for the allowance of their boundaries being infringed upon. That became a problem with the expenditures, as you can see in this quote. I'll come full circle back to that. So to say a good investment was to say, if we can assimilate and eliminate the title of Indian and no longer have to pay for quote unquote Indians, then we can effectively remove that, and this will be a good investment. George Manuel, Indigenous leader and a quote unquote residential school graduate, he also stated that these institutions were the laboratory and production line of the colonial system that was designed to make room for European expansion into a vast empty wilderness, needed an Indian population that it could describe as lazy and shiftless. The colonial system required such an Indian for casual labor. So by creating schools and convincing the Canadian population that entire groups of peoples were being saved and put into schools, which schools were a valued institution by European settlers, and thinking that these generations of children were being educated, but were actually being provided training on how to be that bottom rung in society that everybody else could sort of stack themselves above and provide cheap labor and underpay and all of those sorts of things. That was essentially another reason of the strategy and the assimilative mechanism and the extent of that assimilation. This wasn't to assimilate to say, we really want everybody to come and be, to have these high paying jobs and to be completely educated. It was to create that disconnect and as minimal education to effectively be able to function outside of their own home environments, but not within or integrated into that, into the mainstream society. So did we know? The nation knew, we knew, everybody knew. Dr. Peter Bryce in 1907 published a report. He's a doctor. He published a report and brought it to the federal administration. It was dismissed. So he actually was, after that, shortly constructively ejected out of his position and decided to take what he had learned in his investigation, in his findings, in his book, The Story of a National Crime, which was published in 1922. So despite saying things like, a trail of disease and death has gone on almost unchecked by any serious efforts on the part of the Department of Indian Affairs, owing to the active opposition of Mr. Duncan Campbell Scott, who was in the Department of Indian Affairs. So despite all of that happening, being reported, being published, being frowned upon, that was the extent of it. However, the next year, the government abandons the term boarding and industrial schools and decides to rename the institutions to residential schools. perhaps lessening the connotation around the industrial and boarding focuses. Okay, so going back here as well. So 1923, 1907. So in 1907, it's already known within the administration that this is a flawed and dysfunctional system. 1922, it's published so the nation has access to this knowledge. And it is in the 1950s when Canada decides to advance the expansion to the northern regions into the Arctic that residential schools too advance into the Inuit territory. So despite all of that knowledge of it being dangerous, of it being dysfunctional, it was known to be that, and probably because it was known to do that, it was effectively replicated in the north as well. And that's when the Inuit population started to really fall into dire straits in the residential school experience in the north. Okay, so the intention, assimilation, not education. I actually wanted to even retitle the title of this slide because assimilation at that time was actually considered, believe it or not, a good word in the world of education. So teachers were educated on how to assimilate newly landed immigrants, how to assimilate Indian children, and half-breeds, and all of those sorts of approaches were actually part of teacher training. So the intention, when I say assimilation, not education, go back to what I previously said, and the extent of assimilation is to that bottom rung of the society. So it required a concerted attack on the ontology. This is from the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People report. So it required a concerted attack on the ontology, on the basic cultural patterning of the children and on their worldview. They had to be taught to see and understand the world as a European place within which only European values and belief had meaning. Thus, the wisdom of their cultures would seem to them only savage superstition. A wedge had to be driven not only physically between parent and child, but also culturally and spiritually. Such children would then be separated from their communities forever. So I can't see the room, I can't read the room, but if there are people within the room who have actually, I'll go through this slide first. So what is ontology first? Ontology is, in the very basic terms of the concept, is how we understand what is real. It's how we understand what the fundamental parts of the world are, how everything's connected and related. And language is actually the pathway of understanding that. There are some things that you just simply cannot translate between languages. And that is where you can access those intricacies and that ontology of identifying how one's ancient ancestry sees the world and evaluates what is real. So it was very, very psychologically pragmatic in the sense that the intention to remove language to disrupt that ontology was very intentional and a critical part of residential schools. That's why you'll see in that programs of study concept at the beginning of the timeline identifies the introduction of that concept of programs of study. And at that point in time, that was when the emphasis on English language arts became paramount in concert with the families who were starting to identify, hey, we might need to modify our resources to cater to Indigenous children. So going back here then, it required that concerted attack on the ontology. and the basic cultural patterning of the children. So when they went home, they would be separated forever from their communities. So there's an exercise called the blanket exercise. It was more popular a few years back, but it's a very, very effective emotive exercise that everybody, I think, should go through to kind of experience the colonial history in a matter of hours. And in that exercise, though, and spoiler alert, if you'd like to plug your ears, there is a component where the children return from residential schools. And it's read within there that the families turn their backs on the children that return. And it's to represent the disconnect that is between the families and the children upon their return. But I cannot argue with that concept anymore, because it's because that Indigenous people do not turn their backs on our ancestors, on our next generations, that has allowed us to survive and to prevail despite these targeted attacks. And when we say that they turn their backs, it's almost disjointed. That's not the reality. But if you can imagine, after going to a place where you are trained to believe that your ontology, so the way that you see the world as real, has been this fabrication, and that you have no common language to communicate with your family members, it's almost like you would just ultimately stand there and stare at each other and not be able to look at one another, do more than look at one another, because that would represent the disconnect. But we don't turn our backs on one another. Okay, so I think just talking about the legacy piece, I wanted to mention then and now. So just drawing a comparison of the criminalization of Indigenous mothering. So if we talk about then, at the time of the peak of residential schools, or let's talk about even after residential schools were no longer mandatory, but became sort of these dumping grounds or safe havens for kids who were suffering from socioeconomic issues. And the criminalization of Indigenous mothering started right at the beginning or the evidence rather has been as early as the time of rations. So when rations were given out to mothers who were trying to get food for their children, because the men in the communities roles were completely criminalized. That means hunting, harvesting. I wanted to find the article that I had in another presentation. I couldn't find it today, but it talks about how a woman is riding her horse to go and get rations for her family, and the agents thought that she was pregnant, and how could she be so criminal to be pregnant when she doesn't have enough rations for the children. And it's so mind-blowing, because the situation of requiring rations is a complete manifestation of that colonial structure to, I guess, derail the entire family. Criminalization of Indigenous mothering now. We have social service workers, caseworkers, who, with the best intentions, there are legal cases where children have effectively been removed from their homes because all that the mothers have in their freezer and in their pantries are wild meat and canned goods. As a traditional family, that would probably make you one of the most wealthy mothers, but the criminalization of not having the staples that you would find in a grocery aisle demand an investigation onto negligence by people who don't have the cultural wherewithal to evaluate what is criminal behavior and negligent behavior. Buildings housing Indigenous children. The houses that housed Indigenous children for Indian residential schools were completely over capacity at best, when there were low registrants for the schools for quote unquote Indian children. And when I say that, I mean the children, Indigenous children who carried status, which means that the government would carry an obligation to them as long as the rivers flow and the grass grows. Those children, if there were not enough populating the schools, then the schools would recruit Métis children from the communities and non-status children from the communities to populate the schools and justify them being kept open. That meant that the schools were able to keep open, but they did not receive funding for those additional students who were non-status and Métis. So therefore, fires happened because they were overpopulated and didn't have the money to build additional buildings. They had, just speaking of the housing and going on to the next one, vulnerable disease. So tuberculosis was a dire issue that if nobody's familiar, it's very highly contagious. And because the housing was over capacity, a lot of the children who had tuberculosis were exposed to children who did not. And a lot of deaths, up to 55% of children in those schools died from TB, and unnecessarily. So back up to the now, the buildings housing Indigenous children. Today, with the amount of children that are in care, and I'll get more to those specifics in a second, but the buildings that house Indigenous children today are, at best, I would say, subpar, and that's just being nice. They're being pushed into places like group homes or shelters that are overpopulated. At that point of shelters, a lot of the mothers will get their children apprehended into housing that are with foster parents who are also overcapacitated, and there is a lot of vulnerability that contributes to that. When we talk about vulnerable disease today, that disconnect, and you can look at the statistics that exist in Alberta, are causing mental health disease that is extreme. There are so many deaths by accidental and unintentional overdoses. Those sorts of vulnerable diseases are complete remnants of the colonial legacy that has been left, not only upon Indigenous people, but on non-Indigenous people and on the government for not recognizing that these are, in fact, colonial legacies, and accepting this as a normalized state of being and way of normalcy for Indigenous people, that bottom rung concept. So the Sexual Sterilization Act of 1928, that's in relation to eugenics. So the Sexual Sterilization Act in 1928 targeted people who were feeble-minded and ultimately were able to sterilize people who were presented to a board that reviewed a case, and that board would determine whether or not that they could be sterilized, but only with consent. So it was actually Indigenous people who were highly overrepresented in the sexual sterilizations. And in the sexual sterilizations that happened, the person who was able to consent to that was the principal of the school. So it didn't require somebody who was actually a parent or a guardian or somebody who was concerned, like every other person who was presented to the board. It was actually allowed to be signed off by the directors or the principals of the school. So what is the now sort of parallels of, I guess, sexual sterilization and that remnants of, sorry, I should bring it explicitly home on that. So the majority of the Indigenous people who were sterilized were attendees of Indian residential schools. So today as well, we can say that that colonial legacy exists when we see in the news that there are tube litigations. So tubal litigations are a surgery that happens to prevent a woman from having further pregnancies after they have a child. There is a class action suit happening right now for women Indigenous women who have been given tubal litigations without consent. There's also in the northern regions incentivized birth control. So women are provided grocery funds if they are given Depo-Provera shots, which are, chemical birth control. So there's all sorts of colonial legacies that we almost, I think, normalize, just as if we're not careful to critically analyze, we're normalized then as well. Murder, I think we touched on this. Josh, you mentioned that on the then, and on the now, I think I will just flip over to the children in care. So I put quotes around in care just as I would around residential school. So put simply, the residential school system was an attempt by successive governments to determine the fate of Aboriginal people in Canada by appropriating and reshaping their future in the form of thousands of children who were removed from their homes and communities and placed in the care of strangers. So that is directly about residential schools from the RCAP again, but that could ultimately be, I think, applied to the circumstances of today, which are the deaths of children, youth, and young adults receiving children intervention services and their comparison of Indigenous to non-Indigenous numbers. The 60s scoop as well can ultimately, we can say with certainty that the trajectories are still consistent and the numbers are still consistent with kids being removed from their homes and communities and placed in the care of strangers, as well as we can say that in March of 2020, 70% of children and youth receiving services are Indigenous, whereas only 10% of all children in Alberta are Indigenous. That is a major, major discrepancy. So perhaps there's momentum happening with the programs and the services that are available, but straight from the Office of the Child and Youth Advocacy, it says that yet the facts speak for themselves. Aboriginal children come into care more often, they stay in care longer, they're less likely to be returned to their families than their non-Aboriginal peers. And it's been this way for many years. This is a legacy of colonialism. So what are the actions to take steps forward? Examine the power structures and dynamics at the individual level and the institutional levels. So what I mean by that is at the individual level, what is happening at when you're trying to reconcile and do actions, what is the dynamic happening? So in the scope of education, which is sort of the field that I'm mostly from, when we are providing, when we're providing Christmas gifts for families, what is the dynamic? Are you donating Christmas gifts to the women and the families that you serve for them to give to their children? Or are you providing opportunity for mothers to come and select the gifts for their children, where you're giving the power back to Indigenous people and compensating for the disempowerment and the inequities that are structurally in place against Indigenous people? At an institutional level, what's the function of Indigenous people within the workplace that you work for? Is there still that accepted power differential between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people? Ask, when you're doing any effort that is a call to reconciliation or a moment towards reconciliation, ask yourself, is it liberation or assimilation? And liberation is going to be that place where you can not only liberate the moment, but liberate yourself from that colonial legacy. Because it's not just Indigenous people. Like I said, it is the Canadian consciousness that has this legacy of residential schools, and that us and them, and that power over and power under structure that we have the knowledge and the wherewithal to dismantle and to grow from. And that's one simple question: liberation or assimilation? And acknowledging the word assimilation. Support the former, support liberation. So educate oneself and abandon and park your ego for the process. That's going to be so difficult for so many people because it involves identifying where we're located within this history. We're at a tipping point where most of us were educated in a system that has textbooks that at best had complete erasure of residential school and Indigenous history altogether, and historicized who we are as people, and put who we are in the past, and didn't allow for us to have space and forums to talk about how we still are today, and how we are very distinct and Indigenous and alive and well. Speak up and speak out. Use your agency. Can't say that anymore. Whether you are a aspiring or established ally, or you are an Indigenous person who's discovering yourself, or you are an Indigenous person who's pissed off because this is all old news, and it's about time that we have to stop doing this on a day-to-day to move people forward. Please, speak up, speak out, take any opportunity you're invited to give agency to our ancestors, and correct the wrongdoings of the historical situations of this nation, and to propel forward as our nations, as our global community. Yeah, and I sped through that thinking I'd run out of time. So if there's any questions or comments, I'd love to have them. I don't know how many people are in the room, but we should have some constructive dialogue if there's room for it.
Yeah. Yes, we have. So just click the participants here. First of all, thank you. That was really wonderful, and I learned a lot through that. I mean, wow, no, that was a really great presentation, honestly. So I just want to thank you myself, Jenna, for taking the time out of your afternoon to this wonderful presentation with us. And absolutely, we got time for questions. If anyone has questions or even comments or anything like that, I do see Madison Moyer, you have your hand raised. If you have, I don't know if you have anything you would like to say or anything like that, or if you wanted to start off with a conversation or question or anything like that. Let me go to the chat. People are saying, Carol says Marseille. Chantel says, hi, Jenna. let's see who we got. Let me go to Madison. It says oh, did you raise your hand again? Sorry, just disappeared. Okay, I can click on you. Okay, it says you might be able to unmute yourself. You have a question, Madison.
You're still muted, Madison. Are you trying to talk?
Where is this?
I can hear you, Madison.
You can hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. It was written in the Q&A.
It's okay. Okay.
I was talking about earlier in the slides, if there was a particular book or
yeah, I see the question. So what specific part of the presentation?
So the earlier slides where it was about individual stories.
Was it the Peter Bryce one?
Not that far.
Okay.
Another one. We're going to the start of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know, but we can have though
Yeah.
any resources or books or anything we can definitely send towards your way.
Thank you.
Okay.
I just wanted to say as well, if there's no other quick questions, there is, yeah, so Chantel Gray said, I agree, change the language. They were not schools, they were institutions. And I'll just share a quick story on that actually, which is from this year. And my own, I'm a mother of two boys. One is in kindergarten, one's in grade 2. So they sort of did some exploring around residential schools this year. And my youngest in kindergarten came home, and because we didn't cut his hair until he was about 4, so he remembers that. And he said, it's a good thing that you cut my hair because we're not allowed to have long hair at school. And so it's difficult for kids who, it's called egocentrism. So until they're about, old enough that they can actually comprehend a world beyond their own little innocent kind of selves, it's difficult for them to kind of compartmentalize and say, okay, that was a historical sort of schooling component. So he integrated that into his own identity, just knowing that he is a proud little Indigenous boy. And so there was a lot of unpacking and unlearning and relearning to do. And I'm an educator. I have like a master's degree in education. So I can't imagine how difficult that might be for families or for kids who don't express it, and who just sit and chew on that and don't really know where to put that in their hats. As well, my oldest son, who's in grade 2, and he was reprimanded for it appropriately, but began to say to his younger brother that, oh, well, if you don't do that, then they're going to send you to the gray school. So there was a book that they had read where the pictures had depicted a residential school as a gray building, and, in contrast to the beautiful buildings and the schools that they have now. And so it actually took that for me to have that aha moment to say, okay, we need a solution for this. How do we do this without like making it so complex for kids to understand? And I just thought, why don't we just stop saying schools? Because they weren't schools. They didn't want to educate. They didn't want to teach. They wanted to remove and to disconnect and to train for these, these abhorrent reasons. So I thought, okay, well, let's just abandon schools and say these were government funded You know, and I don't even, I would say even the, what is encyclopedia use, government, what was the word that you used there at the beginning of your presentation, Josh? Sponsored. Sponsorship is like such a good connotation, right? We don't want to say that it's a government sponsored institution. This is a government funded, which is the same synonymously, but a government funded church run institution. Like it was, yeah.
We have two questions already. Sabrine is asking, I'm a newcomer and I really want to educate myself on Indigenous issues. I wanted to ask how, as a new immigrant, I could be an effective ally, even if I'm not in a place of power and privilege. And then say thank you after.
Yeah, good point. That's so true. And that is, there are so many different dynamics within within the I guess Canadian structure. And I think it's just about learning and learning from really informed resources. So we learned today here, like RCAP, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, of course, you know, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Those are extensive. We have the Missing Murdered Indigenous Women report. There are all of these things that our communities have come together and relived the trauma and done so much work to translate that into directives, recommendations, narratives, anecdotes. All of those things are so readily available. And as soon as you start to, I think, learn those histories, it becomes, knowledge is your power. But if I can also say anything, because it can be so overwhelming, there's so much to learn. But if you can shift and say, I need to focus on being critically literate. So I need to be like very well versed in, okay, what's the prerogative here? Like, what's the intention of this curriculum? What's the intention of this policy? What's the intention of this initiative? What's the intention of this funding opportunity? All of those things, and to make sure that the intention always lies in liberation and not assimilation, then that makes you know, an ideal ally, in my humble opinion.
Well, that was a great response. And then we have a question from Taran Chohan. Do you have any insights on how allies can further support, especially when harmful actions and decisions are continuing to be made, including the draft curriculum being proposed here in Alberta?
Yeah, and I'll go back to that example of like the steps forward, like know and be mindful of your individual reach. Don't be stifled by the institutional, I think, domination. And when it comes down to it, just to that example, the curriculum it's going to develop in whatever way, shape, and form, but ultimately, and as a teacher myself, we are professionals and our obligation is ultimately the children who are in our care. And as Indigenous educators, we have done this much and then some to create things called, for example, the teaching quality standard. So that is ultimately our obligation. So if a curriculum comes up that contradicts our ability to be professionals and meet our code and our obligations, then that comes a time where we take a stand and we speak up and we speak out to the government and to our school boards, and or rather, if you're a parent and a community member, to your school board, and if you're an educator, to your respective administration.
Thank you for answering that. So yeah, other people are just saying, once again, you know, thank you, and a lot of people are, you know, agreeing with what you brought up. Chantel says, sorry your boys had to experience that, but also grateful you were there to talk to them. Margot just, yeah, absolutely. They try to kill the Indian and the child. Yeah, that's one that we hear lots. That's a great recommendation, Chantel. Read the book 21 Things You Don't Know About the Indian Act by Bob Joseph. The audiobook's only like 3 hours, honestly. So it's like a pretty easy and quick read you can do. And
Like,
yeah, exactly. Yeah. And yeah, everyone else is just very, like Lexi says, thank you for the insightful presentation. No, everyone's just very grateful for what we provided today. And I'm very grateful too for what you provided for us today too. Karen says, hi, and thank you for this informative session. No problem. And yes, Jesse, just to remind you, yeah, all like for anyone else too, yeah, this is recorded. If you came in late or you had to leave early, well, I guess those who had to leave early, they're not here, but they will be seeing this when they watch this, that this is recorded and you can watch this later in that regard too.
Maybe if we do have a couple of extra minutes.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
May I just talk briefly too, just specifically, and since it is, Louis Riel Day, this is the day that in 1885, Louis Riel, our Métis leader, was executed due to the work that he did to become the founding father of Manitoba and one of the founding fathers of Canada. And of course, I just wanted to, I think, speak a little bit to the complexities around residential schools, Métis schools, Métis Catholicism, which the Catholic Church ran most of the Indian residential schools when the church and government were in cahoots for doing that. So one thing, and this came to me when I was actually working for one of the major school districts, and I attended it was a Christian school, or like a Christian-based school, and we did the blanket exercise and went around, and a lot of the young youth there were really kind of feeling in a funk, like they didn't know how to really take that up, because how do they deal with the fact that their faith demands their allegiance to Jesus and God, at the same time that church was the perpetrator of all of this historical damage. And what I really wanted to share with them, and I'll share here today as well, is that there is so many different dynamics that were at play. So Métis have been, a people, we have been here since, we've been born as a people in, I would say 1700s, and that's arguable. So with that said, there was several years before the implementation of these institutions for assimilation. And when schools came to be, or when Métis came to be, schools were very valued, and Métis communities always wanted to have, for example, like a priest that would travel with the communities, and ultimately that was almost always the educator as well, to school and educate the children in that sense of the word, for literacy and things like that. But when they would, the Métis of those days would come together as a collective, and they would try to secure the best clergy people and priests that they could from across the pond in Europe. They would bring them to the communities, and that person would be, as important as the women and children. They would be in the middle of, those battlefields and protected by the communities. And when residential schools were implemented, they were underpaid. They were atrocious environments, and ultimately the people that were sent to Canada to operate those facilities were the priests and clergy people who weren't qualified enough to actually even work at the churches and the schools in Europe. So there becomes this sort of, I think, a blanket approach to say, okay, well, schools have always been bad, Christian and schools have always been bad, and there's a lot of amalgamation of the history and of the things that happen. But ultimately, what I told those kids in that circle, to simplify things as well, is the church was used as a tool, and the faith was used as a tool to carry out the government's initiative of assimilation and to debase a people so that they didn't have to pay their dues and so that they didn't have to do things the right way, even though it would take more time to move their initiatives forward. So that's sort of the oversimplified version, but it's just, if people walk away and you feel tangled about how to navigate some of these things, since the earliest times of the imperialistic advancement in the Roman days, the church has been hijacked as a tool to oppress other people in the name of industrialization and economic progress. So yeah, I just wanted to also add that so that people could still go home and pray in their own way tonight. Just kidding.
No, Marce, very much for sharing that, and I'm sure everyone was very, very appreciative. And just that's really great too that you on this session that we're able to honor our leader Louis Riel also, and we're able to continue being Michif people as we should be, despite what we've talked about today, despite what the government did to Louis Riel and the Métis people during those periods. No, I think this has been a really great discussion overall. And just to remind everyone too, this is also what we call Métis Week 2 in that case. So I was really glad we were able to host this session too on Métis Week, and also particularly on November 16th, as Jenna worded, the anniversary for when Canada murdered Louis Riel, our leader. So Marce, for everyone who partaked in this session and who took your busy afternoon, I'm sure everyone we're busy during this time, and there's so much Zoom too going on, so I appreciate you all spending this time on Zoom with us. We do have another Indigenous education session planned. It will probably be right now I have a plan for November 30th. If anything changes, I will let anyone know. Otherwise, of course, it will be on 60 Scoops specifically. And I'm excited that we're going to have a woman by the name of Sharon Gladue with us. And she's been a champion of the residential school scene for a bit. So I'm excited to have her. And I just want to thank Jenna, of course, for her time and all the knowledge she has shared with us, and spending her afternoon with us. I know with the position that she has, I imagine she's a very busy person too in that case. So I'm just very appreciative. And if anyone needs any resources or anything, we will make sure to send it forward in your way in that case. So just let me say Marce, and everyone have a great rest of your week. If you folks are in Edmonton or around the Edmonton area, stay warm. There's lots of snow, and I think it's here to stay in that case. So Marce,
take care. Stay